Hi, this is Mark Millar, keynote speaker and author of the book, Global Supply Chain Ecosystems. I'm pleased to share with you my insights about logistics dynamics in the world of COVID-19. Logistics underpins the global economy. Logistics is the glue that connects, enables, and empowers the global supply chain ecosystems that put food on our tables, clothes on our backs, smartphones in our pockets, and medical supplies in our hospitals. A 10 trillion US dollar industry that employs hundreds of millions of workers worldwide. The business of logistics is the logistics of business. As COVID-19 wreaked havoc on communities and economies around the world, supply chain risks were brutally exposed. Trade flows became severely disrupted, and the transport of goods became extremely challenging. Logistics is a people-centric business, so coronavirus restrictions have harshly impacted all types of logistics activities. COVID lockdowns trapped people at home. They couldn't get to work. Transport limitations made it difficult for people to travel to work. Social distancing rules restricted what people could do when they were at work. And of course, border closures impeded the international movement of goods. These COVID restrictions limited the availability of labor in warehouses and container ports, and further exacerbated the shortage of truck drivers, which in turn led to delays and congestion throughout global supply chains, coupled with massive, unprecedented disruption to the global logistics sector. Let's explore these logistics dynamics in the world of COVID-19. In sea freight, the shipping lines were very quick to respond, initially idling capacity, then they forcefully limited supply using ad hoc cancellations of scheduled services. This is known as blank sailings. As COVID spread unevenly around the world, the volatility of freight flows completely upset the traditional balance between supply and demand. Delays and congestion throughout the supply chain resulted in shipping containers being in use much longer than normal, thereby delaying the return of empty containers back into the system, resulting in the worldwide shortage of shipping containers. These challenges in sea freight were then further compounded by the complete blockage of the all-important Suez Canal for almost 1 week. The loss of equilibrium in the container shipping sector has resulted in significantly higher freight rates, which are likely to continue through to next year and well beyond. Shipping lines are now engaged in active capacity management, helping many of them return to healthy profits, no doubt much welcomed in this capital-intensive sector, notorious for its boom-bust cycles. In warehousing, the huge fluctuations in consumer demand, together with the postponement or cancellation of production orders, put severe strains on warehousing capacity around the world. COVID-19 vividly exposed the profound interdependencies in today's global supply chains and will redefine the warehousing sector over the medium term. As supply chain resilience moves to the top of the priority list, inventory will no longer be perceived as evil. Many of the finely tuned lean and just-in-time industrial systems will be replaced or supplemented with business models that incorporate buffer inventories and safety stocks. This will result in the need for ever more warehouse space to store the additional inventory, involving both larger warehouses and more warehouses. Other coronavirus dynamics include an increase in the outsourcing of warehouse operations to third-party logistics providers, which will result in a greater adoption of multi-user warehousing and in turn drive the need for more warehouses. In air freight, the widespread grounding of passenger planes also removed their belly hold space, which is used to transport cargo. thereby very abruptly eliminating almost 50% of global air freight capacity. Freighter airlines and charter operators experienced a much welcomed renaissance at shockingly expensive rates, as top priority was given to urgent needs for PPE equipment and medical supplies. Several airlines used their passenger planes to carry freight, with packages of products strapped into the seats. Some carriers went one step further and actually removed all the seats, enabling the whole passenger deck to be utilized for cargo. Whatever the creative solutions offered by the airlines, the cost of air freight has rocketed to record high levels. These high rates will continue for some time because the International Air Transport Association predict that air travel will not fully recover until year 2024. So belly hold cargo space will remain severely constrained. In the meantime, the specialist aircraft conversion companies are enjoying a surge in orders for older passenger planes to be transformed into freighter aircraft. Through the short term, we can expect these rather chaotic logistics dynamics to continue. However, over the medium to long term, perhaps the most enduring logistics dynamics of COVID-19 will arise from the post-pandemic reconfiguration of global trade. Striving to increase resilience and reduce interdependencies, companies will be deploying supply chain diversification and nearshoring strategies such that by year 2025, we can expect a much different landscape, one that is oriented more towards regional supply chains. This regional approach will result in shorter supply chains that increase control, responsiveness, and resilience, whilst also reducing lead times, transport costs, and emissions. The logistics dynamics of these regional supply chains will be felt in three key areas: less miles, more moves, and modal shifts. Firstly, less miles. As intra-regional trade flows increase, the logistics dynamics of these shorter supply chains are that cargo movements will tend to involve shorter distances, as the goods will have less miles to travel. This results in more short-haul carriage at the expense of long-haul transport, which has consequences for the logistics industry, in particular for the intercontinental freight forwarding sector. Secondly, more moves. In this shifting globalization landscape, incorporating nearshoring and onshoring initiatives, the reconfigured shorter supply chains will also mean more moves due to the increased amount of domestic freight movements. Research by Stifel found that when products are manufactured domestically, there are 4 times as many in-country freight journeys compared to when products are imported from overseas. 4 times as many. Great news for local logistics providers. And thirdly, modal shifts. The shorter distances involved in intra-regional trade will also diminish the relative speed advantage of fast and expensive air freight over slower, cheaper sea freight. Within a regional supply chain, the difference in door-to-door transit times for sea freight versus air freight is likely to be just a few days, as opposed to a few weeks in an intercontinental supply chain. We can therefore expect modal shifts, whereby some cargoes traditionally transported by air will, in the context of a regional supply chain, migrate to the much more economical sea freight alternative. The logistics dynamics arising from these reconfigured supply chains will offer more options for ground-based freight transport networks. Many regional supply chains will encompass large contiguous land masses, such as in Western Europe, North America, and much of the Asia-Pacific region. In these cases, economic or ground-based freight transport options, such as trucking and rail freight, will increasingly come into play as competitive, cost-effective alternatives to traditional air or sea freight. This is particularly applicable where there are low-friction internal borders, which are typically enabled by preferential trade agreements, such as the United States, Mexico, Canada agreement, or within the European Union, and also in the recently completed China-led Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, which links 15 economies across Asia. Talking of ground freight options, the COVID crisis has reinvigorated interest in the new Silk Railroad, which now connects 70 Chinese cities by rail to over 40 cities across 19 countries in Europe. An intermediate option between fast but expensive air freight and cheap but slow sea freight, this long-haul rail freight alternative can transport cargo from China into Europe in just 12 to 17 days, saving at least 2 weeks off the typical sea freight transit time of 35 days, whilst being considerably cheaper than air freight. China Railway is now operating over 1,000 freight trains per month into Europe, representing a 70% year-on-year increase in services. This rail freight option is particularly relevant for manufacturing output produced by China's inland factories, which are located far away from the export gateway container ports on the eastern seaboard. In conclusion, let me summarize the logistics dynamics in the world of COVID-19. The short term will be characterized by market volatility. Air freight capacity will remain severely limited and very expensive. Sea freight uncertainties will continue, intensified by blank sailings, container shortages, port congestion issues, and high freight rates. Over the medium term, we expect a significant increase in demand for warehousing as inventory levels increase throughout the extended supply chain. However, over the medium to long term, the greatest COVID impact on logistics dynamics will come from the inevitable reconfiguration of global supply chains towards a much more regionalized approach, resulting in less miles, more moves, and modal shifts, whilst increasing opportunities for ground-based road and rail freight transport networks. Through to year 2025, the next normal dynamics of regional trade, localized production, and shorter supply chains will represent both challenges and opportunities for logistics freight transport companies, who will need to adapt accordingly in order to survive and thrive, because logistics is what facilitates trade and commerce around the world.